At noon, Abigail received a message from Hudson. Abigail, 6:30 in the evening, the usual place. Because of this message, Abigail took half a day off, tidied up from head to toe, and even skipped lunch. Abigail likes Hudson, but she has never confessed. At first, she didn't dare, and when she finally decided to confess, Hudson got a girlfriend. Kinsley, a woman who made Abigail feel inferior for nearly 5 years, Hudson's goddess. Abigail thought she would have to swallow the bitterness of unrequited love for a lifetime, but 2 years ago, Hudson broke up with Kinsley. Abigail knew her chance had come. During Hudson's decadent 2 years, she accompanied him through drunkenness, comforted his frustration, and shared his loneliness. Their relationship started to progress, and it was half a month ago when Hudson knocked on her door, reeking of alcohol, tearing her nightgown. He wanted it, and Abigail gave it to him. These years of keeping herself pure were also for him. Now, the person on her is him, and she willingly accepts it. But, at the critical moment, he bit her ear and called Kinsley's name. Abigail loves Hudson, can tolerate everything about him, and can even accept that Kinsley is his true love, even if she only has a tiny place in his heart. She is willing to accept it. However, he can't insult her like this, especially not on her bed, calling out another woman's name. So, with all her strength, she pushed Hudson away, preserving her last shred of dignity. Because she pushed too hard, he fell to the ground. Hudson, naked, got up from the ground, quietly looked at her for a while, then said, "I'm sorry," put on his clothes, and left. After going back, Hudson sent her a message, saying he needed to think about their relationship. Then, he didn't contact her for half a month. So, when Abigail received his message today, she was excited. She thought she had finally waited for him. However, in the hot pot restaurant, Hudson had his arm around Kinsley's shoulder. "Abigail, Kinsley is back, and we're back together." In the hot pot restaurant, Hudson pointed to a refined man. "Abigail, this is Nicholas. He's a good person, and I think you two would be a good match." In the old district of North Street, there's a hot pot restaurant named The Old Place, and it's Hudson's favorite. In the cold winter, Abigail thought there was nothing warmer than enjoying hot pot with someone you liked. But at this moment, she felt like she had fallen into an ice cellar. Despite the steam from the hot pot making her sweat and even with the air conditioning making her take off her down jacket, she still felt cold. Holding the freshly poured hot water, her palms pressed tightly against the hot cup. She even thought of lifting it to her lips, trying to see if the scalding water could warm her freezing heart. However, before it reached her mouth, a hand reached out and took her cup. Abigail looked up in confusion. It was Nicholas, the man who took her cup. "Not hot?" he asked. "Hot." Abigail shook her head. She didn't feel it was hot because she was frozen at the moment, lacking sensation. In a daze, Hudson handed her a cup of mango juice. "You like this the most? Take a sip when you're thirsty." Abigail glanced at him. Their eyes met, and suddenly she understood, Hudson did this on purpose. He knew she had been waiting for his response for the past half-month, and Kinsley and Nicholas were his answer to her. His answer was that he chose Kinsley, and Nicholas's role was to make her completely give up, to make her understand that no matter how much time passed, he would never choose her. Abigail turned her face stiffly, lowered her head, and pressed her hand against her chest. Because it hurt there, an endless stream of bitterness and suffocation surged up, making it hard for her to breathe. If tonight Hudson had just told her that he and Kinsley got back together, Abigail thought she could accept it. Because she knew herself. No matter when or where, as long as Kinsley stood there, she had already lost. She would retract into her shell again and not disturb them. What she couldn't accept was why he chose this day to push her towards someone else. Abigail picked up the cup of mango juice and took a sip, extinguishing the last flame in her heart. The flame that had burned for half a month flickered for a moment and then went out completely. At the dining table, Kinsley spoke a lot, and Hudson smiled a lot. They were immersed in their own world of affection. Later, they started matchmaking between Abigail and Nicholas. Kinsley said, "Abigail, you're 27 this year. You can't avoid dating forever. Always staying by Hudson's side, what's going on?" Hudson added, "Abigail, Nicholas is the most reliable among all my friends. He's 3 years older than you, a really good person. You two should give it a try." Abigail wanted to run. She wanted to escape from here because too much unspeakable pain and embarrassment made it hard for her to breathe. She didn't want to stay here anymore, but her legs under the table kept trembling, and she couldn't stand up. In the midst of extreme embarrassment, a warm voice sounded in her ear, "Abigail, can I pursue you?" 3 pairs of eyes looked over simultaneously. Abigail felt a myriad of emotions rushing through her, and whether it was moisture in her eyes or something else, she suddenly felt Hudson's face becoming blurry. After a while, she looked at Nicholas and said, "Yes." As soon as the words were spoken, Kinsley's sharp voice rang in her ears. "Hudson, you spilled your drink, it's on my dress." "Oh my, I just bought it yesterday." Abigail lowered her head in self-mockery. "Look, how happy Hudson is. He can finally get rid of her." Hudson and Nicholas had both been drinking, and neither could drive. Hudson said to Nicholas, "Call a designated driver, and let's all go together." In an attempt to get closer to Hudson, Abigail had bought a house right across the street from him. Her friends had advised her against such impulsiveness, saying distance adds charm, but she went ahead with it. So, when Hudson asked her to join, it was just because it was convenient. Abigail glanced at Kinsley, who looked thoroughly unwilling. She pursed her lips and, for the first time, opposed Hudson. Pointing to Nicholas, she said, "I'll take him home." She understood Hudson's indifference, comprehended his dismissal. Pretending to be clueless would just be degrading herself. Hudson seemed surprised that Abigail would defy him, still holding the car door open for her. Without looking at him, Abigail turned and helped the slightly swaying Nicholas to her car. In the night, Hudson watched as Abigail's car drove away, taking a long time to snap out of it. It wasn't until Kinsley impatiently urged him that he finally pulled open the passenger door and got in. Soon, the 2 cars went in different directions. It took Abigail 5 minutes to realize she hadn't asked for the address. She parked the car on the side of the road and took out her phone to open the navigation. "You're home? Nicholas, I guess you didn't remember my name. I'm Nicholas." Nicholas sat in the passenger seat, tilting his head, smiling gently. Abigail's scrolling hand hesitated for a moment on the screen, about to speak, but then she heard him say, "Turn left at the end of this road, then drive for 10 minutes, that's my place." Abigail put down her phone but didn't rush to start the car. An inexplicable frustration surged in her heart. She turned to look at him. This was the first time tonight that she looked at him directly. Unsure if it was an illusion, his handsome face seemed oddly familiar, as if she had seen it somewhere. Unable to recall, her mind was in disarray. Abigail shook her head and said, "I want to smoke. Do you mind?" Nicholas nodded with a smile, "Sure, give me one too. I feel like smoking." After that, neither of them spoke. The pungent smell of smoke filled the narrow space. Abigail opened a window a little, letting the biting cold wind in, making her feel a bit more awake. "You like Hudson?" Nicholas's confident voice sounded in her ear, and Abigail paused, feeling a bitter sourness spreading in her chest. See, in just a short dinner, a stranger could see through her thoughts, while Hudson had ignored her for 11 years. Her unrequited love was so pitiful. Abigail flicked the cigarette butt out of the window. "Yes, I used you just now, but I don't want to apologize. You were brought here by Hudson at the last minute, right? Since it's all an act, we can end it now." She restarted the car, intending to quickly take him home. Nicholas opened a window a little, flicking the cigarette butt outside. "Used me to retaliate against him?" Abigail gripped the steering wheel, feeling bitter. Her face carried a mocking tone. "Retaliate? He doesn't like me. What am I retaliating against?" People like her, who harbored a one-sided crush, had no right to retaliate. She just wanted to give herself a bit of dignity in the end. If Hudson wanted her to give up, she would. In the car, Nicholas fell silent for a moment before asking, "Do you still plan to like him?" This question was easy to answer, but Abigail took a full 10 minutes to suppress the throbbing pain in her heart before saying, "No, I don't want to become an annoying, clingy follower that nobody can shake off." Nicholas looked at her, his gaze profound. "Although I'm Hudson's friend, he can't force me in matters like this. I'm here willingly." Abigail focused on driving, choosing to ignore his words. After that day, Abigail, in an effort to completely forget Hudson, threw herself into work entirely. As a female white-collar worker in an investment bank, she happened to be quite busy during this time. Therefore, there wasn't much space left in her mind for Hudson, which provided a convenient buffer for the humiliation and hurt he had caused her. Nicholas called her a few times, presumably with the number Hudson provided. He wanted to take her out for a meal, but Abigail declined because she had no intention of developing anything further with him. Later, Nicholas found her at the company, probably with the address Hudson provided. Abigail still refused. Then came Hudson. "Abigail, have you been busy lately? Why don't you answer my calls or reply to my messages?" His voice carried accusations and discontent. Abigail saw him frowning, and instinctively wanted to explain but didn't know what to say. Clearly, he had been busy dating Kinsley during this time, rarely contacting her, and when he did, it was often in the middle of the night. She saw it and simply chose to ignore. Awkwardly, Nicholas threw the cigarette on the ground, stomped it out with his leather shoe, and walked briskly toward Abigail. Right in front of Hudson, he embraced her and said, "She's indeed busy. We've been dating recently." Abigail's body stiffened. Apart from Hudson, she wasn't used to such intimate contact with another man. She subconsciously wanted to push him away, but when she caught a glimpse of Hudson's inscrutable handsome face, she stopped, allowing Nicholas to hold her. Hudson stared at the hand Nicholas placed on Abigail's shoulder, fell silent for a moment, then shifted his gaze to Abigail's face. It took a long time before he said, "Abigail, go home earlier today. I have something to tell you." Abigail was about to agree out of habit, but changed her mind before Hudson could speak. "We're going out for dinner in a while, and then we'll watch a movie. I don't know when we'll be back. How about another day?" After saying this, without waiting for Hudson's response, she pulled Nicholas's hand down from her shoulder and led him around Hudson. Hudson stood in place, watching their retreating figures for a long time before finally leaving. After escaping from Hudson's side, Abigail remained in a daze. When she snapped back to reality, Nicholas had already parked the car outside a grilled fish restaurant. Abigail intended to hail a cab to leave, but Nicholas stopped her, saying, "Abigail, you've used me twice, you should give me the time for a meal." After studying him for a moment, Abigail obediently followed him inside. Firstly, she was genuinely hungry, and secondly, she felt that this entanglement needed resolution. Abigail wanted to drink, and since Nicholas couldn't due to driving, she had a bottle by herself. Nicholas praised her for having a good alcohol tolerance. Abigail fell silent, realizing that smoking and drinking were habits she picked up from Hudson. He said that smoking alone was boring, so she learned to smoke. As for drinking, it was because Hudson mentioned that Kinsley looked cute when she was drunk. So, on his birthday, she drank a lot. Unable to handle hard liquor, she vomited and continued drinking. It was her first time drinking, and she ended up in the hospital. Many friends laughed at her. Hudson didn't laugh. Instead, he scolded those people and held her hand with the fore, saying, "Abigail, it's okay. I'm here with you. Don't be afraid." Abigail often wondered if she would have given up earlier if Hudson had never shown her any tenderness. Nicholas put down his chopsticks, took a sip of water, and indicated that it seemed like they were about to have a serious conversation. Abigail also put down her chopsticks, preparing to listen attentively. Without saying a word, Nicholas took out his phone from his pocket, swiped it a few times, and pushed it toward her. Abigail glanced at it, and her complexion changed slightly. She trembled all over. The woman in the photos was her. She remembered this outfit. It was from Hudson's birthday party, the time she ended up in the hospital from drinking. In the photos, there were actually two people, her and Hudson. The person taking the pictures was skilled at capturing angles, and her gaze happened to fall on Hudson. Nicholas told her to scroll back. Abigail flipped through 5 or 6 photos, all of her looking at Hudson. Profound affection was palpable, unattainable, unrequited love evident from these few photos. Abigail felt that her expression must be terrible right now, but she wanted to laugh because it felt ridiculous and absurd. "So, are you deliberately telling me that you knew I liked Hudson 5 years ago? So what? What does it matter that you know?" Abigail's rational side told her to stay calm, but she couldn't control it. The embarrassment spreading from the depths of her heart to her limbs made her voice a bit sharp. "Let me tell you the truth. I've liked him for more than 5 years. It's been 11 years. I liked him since the first year of high school, from the moment I saw him in the classroom." She glared at Nicholas like a cat with its tail stepped on, ignoring the gazes from around. She looked like a hedgehog. "So what? Do you want to mock me for being presumptuous? Or do you want to scold me for being stupid? Or do you want to say that I'm a clown from start to finish, and I deserve it? Well, go ahead, scold me. I'm listening." Abigail started a bit hysterical but became quieter as time passed. Nicholas, with a clear sense of guilt on his handsome face, apologized after a long while. His voice sounded hoarse. "Sorry, I never meant it that way. Showing you these photos was just to tell you that I've been paying attention to you since 5 years ago." Abigail remained silent, picked up her chopsticks, and started picking out fish bones. Nicholas continued, "Abigail, 5 years ago at Hudson's birthday party, I saw you for the first time and just thought you were very beautiful, completely in line with my aesthetic. I'm a photographer, and I thought that scene had a special feeling, so I took those photos." Hearing this, Abigail paused with the chopsticks in her hand, raised her head to look at him, realizing why she found this face familiar. She had indeed seen it before. Nicholas saw her look up, continuing, "Later, you got drunk and bumped into me, mistaking me for Hudson when you came out of the restroom. At that time, I just thought you were cute, but I had no other thoughts about you because I knew you liked Hudson. The second time I saw you was again at Hudson's birthday party, after a year. I found that my interest in you hadn't disappeared. At that time, I wanted to pursue you, but your heart and eyes were filled with Hudson. I tried to strike up a conversation with you several times, but you ignored me, so I gave up. Because of work, I left for a few years. I only came back a month ago. Later, when I was drinking with Hudson, I found out that he got back together with Kinsley. I told Hudson that I wanted to pursue you, which led to the hot pot restaurant incident." After listening, Abigail's mind was filled with one phrase: when he was drinking with Hudson, he saw him getting back together with Kinsley. Her body trembled slightly, and when she asked Nicholas when he had drinks with Hudson, hearing the answer, Abigail felt an icy chill throughout her body. So, the day after Hudson tore her nightgown, Kinsley returned. Therefore, at that time, Hudson had already reconciled with Kinsley. Hence, for the following 2 weeks, Hudson didn't contact her, didn't reply to her messages, he was with Kinsley. Abigail suddenly realized that she couldn't quite understand Hudson. If he had already gotten back together with Kinsley, why didn't he straightforwardly tell her? Perhaps, in Hudson's eyes, she had always been a clown, more so a joke, an outright joke. Abigail's emotions came and went quickly. When tears couldn't be held back, she picked up her bag from the chair and walked out. Nicholas hurriedly caught up after paying the bill. In the snowy landscape, Abigail squatted on the ground and cried freely. When she tried to stand up after crying, she realized it was snowing. The snowfall was heavy, but almost no snowflakes touched her. Looking up, she found Nicholas had opened his coat to shield her from the heavy snow. Abigail cried again because she felt as if she saw herself. When Hudson had just broken up with Kinsley, it was also on a snowy day like this. Hudson had passed out outside a bar, and she couldn't move him. Taxis were unavailable, and calling friends meant waiting for at least half an hour. During those 30 minutes, she shielded him from the snow like this, almost turning into a snowman. That night, she began to run a high fever. Abigail's legs felt numb, and she couldn't stand up. Nicholas took off his coat and draped it over her. Ignoring her objections, he lifted her onto his back and walked step by step through the thick snow. In this moment, Nicholas's image in Abigail's heart instantly became towering. The sharpness from before had disappeared. Abigail lay on his back, covering his head with the coat, inadvertently touching his face with her hand, which felt like ice. Abigail regretted her earlier reckless running. Now, the parking lot was at least a 15-minute walk away. After hesitating for a moment, she reached out and covered Nicholas's face, also pressing her face against his icy ear. Nicholas's steps paused, and with Abigail's movement, he lifted her body slightly. He was already shivering from the cold, but his lips curled up slightly as Abigail's hand touched his face. Abigail, feeling remorseful, muttered, "I'm sorry." She had run randomly, and now the distance to the parking lot was substantial. After a brief pause, she stretched out her hand and covered Nicholas's face. Simultaneously, she pressed her own face against his frigid ear. Nicholas's steps halted, and in response to Abigail's movements, he lifted her body slightly. Shivering from the cold, he managed a slight smile as Abigail's hand brushed his face. Nicholas said, "Abigail, you understand the pain of unrequited love the most. Give me a chance and give yourself a chance. If you really want to forget Hudson, try with me." Initially, Abigail felt a bit repulsed, but when Nicholas carefully placed her in the car, she heard herself saying, "Okay." Back home at around 1 a.m., Abigail entered her password, and as the door closed behind her, she heard it open again. "Why are you back so late?" Hudson's voice echoed abruptly in the quiet hallway. Abigail sighed quietly, adjusting her emotions before turning around slowly. "I told you, went for dinner and a movie. I'd be back late." Abigail smiled, her expression seemingly unchanged, with a subtle curve at the corner of her lips, as usual. Hudson's gaze focused directly on her face, probing and scrutinizing. Abigail, feeling the chill, rubbed her hands together, urging, "It's too late, go to bed. Goodbye." With that, she turned and went into her room, closing the door behind her. Hudson followed, and Abigail stood at the doorway for a few seconds before joining him in the living room. Neither spoke, and an awkward and eerie silence hung in the air. It wasn't until Abigail's phone rang, a message from Nicholas saying he had reached home, that she broke the silence. She quickly replied to him. As she did, Hudson's voice, tinged with sarcasm, cut through. "Are you really together with Nicholas?" Abigail's hand paused on the screen for a moment. After a few seconds, she looked up, smiling. "Yes, indeed. Speaking of which, I should thank you. Nicholas is really nice." Hudson remained silent, his expression darkening. He didn't know how to respond, feeling an inexplicable sense of frustration. After fumbling with his hands, unable to find his cigarette pack, and growing more irritated, a slender hand appeared in front of him. Abigail offered him a cigarette, and as he took a drag, she lit it for him. "Smoke less in the future. I remember Kinsley doesn't like the smell of smoke," she said before turning back to her spot. Hudson finished the cigarette, his voice hoarse as he apologized. "I'm sorry." Abigail understood why he was apologizing, for that night's overstepping, mistaking her for Kinsley, and disappearing for half a month without contact. Because, ultimately, he didn't love her, and he couldn't accept her in any way. Abigail touched her chest, trying to ignore the sourness and resentment welling up there. "Hudson, let's forget about that night. Pretend you didn't knock on my door. You go back to being with Kinsley, and I'll be with Nicholas. Let's just leave it at that." Nicholas has a fever. Feeling guilty, Abigail took care of him all day, accompanied him to the hospital, and cooked porridge for him. When she came out of the kitchen, Nicholas was already asleep on the couch. Perhaps due to being sick, he slept deeply. Abigail called his name a couple of times, but he didn't respond. However, his brows were slightly furrowed, indicating an uneasy sleep. Abigail squatted on the floor, observing Nicholas openly for the first time. Compared to Hudson's handsomeness, Nicholas had a more refined appearance. While asleep, his face carried a harmless elegance. After a while, Abigail, feeling tired from squatting, stood up, intending to find a blanket or some clothes to cover him. However, as she lifted herself halfway, her wrist was grabbed. Instinctively, she tried to shake him off. Surprisingly, Nicholas, who had been sound asleep, had opened his eyes. His eyes had a faint redness, and his voice was husky and seductive. "Abigail, let me hold you." Still in a daze, Abigail hadn't fully processed the situation when Nicholas forcefully pulled her into his arms. Her chin bumped against his chest, causing a bit of pain. Nicholas held her soft body tightly, and the more she struggled, the tighter his arms became. After a brief standoff, just as Abigail was about to express her displeasure, Nicholas, with a weary and sleepy voice, spoke from his neck. "Abigail, I caught a fever because I gave you my clothes. You have to take responsibility. Let me hold you for a while, I'm really tired. Don't move around." Abigail couldn't refuse this reason because he was telling the truth. Indeed, he got sick because of her. The couch barely accommodated the two of them. Abigail lay stiffly on his chest, her arms wrapped around his shoulders because that was the only position that made her somewhat comfortable. Abigail waited for Nicholas to fall asleep before planning to leave. However, before he could drift off, Hudson's call came in. "Abigail, my stomach hurts. Come to the hospital and keep me company." Abigail glanced at Nicholas, still asleep with a slight tremor in his eyelashes. She replied, "Hudson, find Kinsley. Nicholas is sick, and I need to be with him." On the phone, Hudson fell silent for a moment before speaking in a slightly irritated and mocking tone. "Abigail, every time my stomach hurts, you come to accompany me. What, you have a boyfriend now and don't care about me?" Abigail remained silent for a moment and then said, "Hudson, I can't manage your life forever, nor can I accompany you forever. Find your girlfriend." After ending the call, Nicholas opened his eyes. He said, "Abigail, do you think Hudson regrets it? Has he realized that he actually likes you? Abigail couldn't help but find the question amusing, a self-deprecating smile playing on her lips. Hudson's dependence on her was merely a long-standing habit, unrelated to love. Habits can be broken, she said. Nicholas didn't respond to her words, he just held her tightly and soon fell into a deep sleep. After that day, Abigail and Nicholas's relationship didn't progress rapidly, but subtle changes occurred. After officially dating for half a month, Nicholas wanted to hold her hand, stating that it was the most normal contact between couples. Abigail thought, since they had already slept together that day, holding hands was nothing, so she accepted. From then on, Nicholas would hold her hand whenever they met. 1 month into their official relationship, Nicholas wanted to kiss her cheek, saying it was the most common way for couples to express affection. Abigail thought, since he had already slept with his face against hers that day, kissing her cheek was acceptable. Thus, Nicholas would kiss her face whenever they met or parted. 3 months into their official relationship, Nicholas asked if they could kiss. He said he had been holding back for a while and couldn't resist anymore. Kissing made Abigail think of Hudson. Her first kiss was with Hudson, on the night he got drunk and tore her nightgown. It was their first intimate encounter and also the only one. Abigail thought, fortunately, she didn't give her virginity to Hudson, otherwise, she would be more embarrassed now, perhaps unable to face Hudson again. Speaking of Hudson, she hadn't seen him in 3 months. Hudson went on a trip with Kinsley. Nicholas didn't lie to her. Indeed, starting a new relationship could temporarily push aside the pain from the previous one. At least, in the 3 months with Nicholas, she rarely thought of Hudson. Aside from work hours, Nicholas would schedule their dates quite tightly. In just 3 months, he had a clear understanding of her preferences. He knew she liked her coffee black, disliked cilantro, enjoyed sweet treats, and even knew she insisted on peeling the strings off oranges when eating them. When Nicholas proposed the idea of kissing, Abigail neither nodded nor shook her head. Instead, she voiced the lingering question in her mind. She asked him, "Why are you so aware of my preferences when I haven't told you anything?" Nicholas replied, "Because every move and action of yours is in my line of sight. After observing a few times, naturally, I learned. Sometimes, falling for someone was simple. It might be a specific moment or a particular phrase that effortlessly broke through one's psychological defenses." She knew she hadn't developed feelings for Nicholas yet, but at this moment, she felt a flutter in her heart. So, she tiptoed, embraced Nicholas's neck, and kissed him. Nicholas noticeably paused for a moment, then gradually deepened the kiss. Finally, when Abigail was limp in his arms, she heard Nicholas ask, "Abigail, can I interpret this as you've reserved a tiny space for me in your heart?" Abigail didn't answer because she didn't know how to respond. She didn't know why she kissed him, but she felt something stir within her. Why did she kiss him? Because she felt a flutter. Why did she feel a flutter? Because Nicholas's words touched her. There was a time when she dedicated herself to Hudson in the same way. This was the first time someone had genuinely treated her like this. Looking at the disappointment on Nicholas's face, Abigail suddenly felt a pang of sympathy. She reached out and hugged Nicholas. "Although it's not much, there's a place for you." Abigail thought there should be, if not, she wouldn't have come this far with him. When Hudson returned from his trip, Abigail and Nicholas had just been dating for 6 months. Hudson deliberately chose to return on the day before his birthday. When Abigail received his call, she was at Nicholas's company, keeping him company during overtime. "Abigail, why haven't you come yet?" Upon hearing Hudson's words, Abigail was momentarily stunned and didn't immediately respond. "What? Go where?" In the call, Hudson remained silent for a while before speaking with a hoarse voice. "Abigail, did you forget that tomorrow is my birthday?" "Birthday?" Abigail picked up Nicholas's phone from the table and checked the date, suddenly realizing that tomorrow was Hudson's birthday. She instantly understood his meaning. Hudson didn't like celebrating birthdays outside, so every year, Abigail would help him decorate the room at home a day in advance. Abigail apologized, saying that she had been with Nicholas recently and genuinely forgot. Hudson seemed to light a cigarette and muttered a vague, "It's okay." Then he asked if she could come over now because he might be too busy later. Abigail glanced at Nicholas, who gave her a look that said, "It's your decision, I respect whatever you choose," then went back to focusing on his computer, the mouse unmoving. Holding her phone, Abigail hesitated. "Nicholas is still working overtime, and will be going for dinner later. We might not have time to help you." In the call, Hudson fell into silence again. Abigail couldn't hear his response, feeling that she might have been too harsh in her words. Softening her tone, she said, "You should ask Kinsley. Her opinion matters a lot for your birthday celebration." After saying this, Hudson seemed to scoff, his tone more sarcastic. He said, "Abigail, how come I didn't realize over these years that you're also a scoundrel who forgets friends for a lover?" Abigail hung up the phone and turned to look at Nicholas. She found Hudson increasingly difficult to understand, but now she needed to reevaluate Nicholas's place in her heart. It was incredible that she had forgotten Hudson's birthday. Nicholas put down the mouse, turned around, and pulled her into his arms, his chin resting on her shoulder. Abigail felt something strange about him and asked what was wrong. Nicholas remained silent for a while before saying, "Abigail, Hudson and Kinsley broke up." Abigail was stunned, suddenly realizing why Hudson had been acting strangely when she mentioned Kinsley earlier. Nicholas didn't hear her response, dared not lift his head to meet her eyes, and certainly didn't dare to ask her that question. Some things, when you get used to doing them, everyone will scold you if one day you stop. Like Hudson's birthday. As Abigail entered with Nicholas, many people rushed over, asking why she hadn't decorated Hudson's room and if she had forgotten. These people were Hudson's friends first and then Abigail's friends, most of whom knew that Abigail liked Hudson. At this moment, Abigail regretted two things. First, not listening to her best friend's advice and buying a house right across from Hudson's. Second, letting these people think she was Hudson's accessory. Uncertain of how to explain, Nicholas warmly held her hand. Without looking at her, he smiled at everyone and said, "You guys are interesting. Why should my girlfriend arrange things? If we look at it from a friend's perspective, all of you are his friends, so why don't you help?" Nicholas's words silenced the entire living room. It was only now that everyone remembered Abigail was no longer the little tail behind Hudson, she was now Nicholas's girlfriend. Today's birthday banquet was eerie, the atmosphere was strange, and the people were peculiar. As the birthday star, Hudson only said one thing throughout, "Abigail, where's my gift?" Every year, Abigail would carefully prepare gifts for Hudson, mostly handmade. But this year, she forgot his birthday, so naturally, there was no well-prepared gift. She remained silent, turning to look at Nicholas. After dinner last night, Nicholas had kissed her passionately in the car for a long time. Her mind was dizzy, and she forgot about buying a gift. Today, after a busy day at work, when she finally remembered, Nicholas said he had already bought one. Nicholas took out a square box of about 10 inches and handed it to Hudson, smiling, "Happy birthday, this is a gift from Abigail and me." Somehow, Hudson seemed offended by Nicholas's words. In any case, Hudson's face didn't look good. He took the gift, threw it aside carelessly, and started drinking alone. Abigail observed his mood, and unlike before when Hudson's bad mood would make her anxious, now she felt an unusual calmness inside. Abigail thought that Hudson's mood must be because of Kinsley. She didn't ask why they broke up again, but considering Hudson's deep love for Kinsley, it was normal for him to be irritable after a breakup. Unfortunately, this time, he could only heal himself. After a round of heavy drinking, the men were all a bit drunk, including Nicholas. As they were leaving, Hudson asked Nicholas if he wanted to call a designated driver. Supporting Nicholas, who was swaying, Abigail turned to Hudson and said, "No need, he's staying at my place tonight, and I'll take care of him." Someone in the crowd whistled, and Hudson's brow furrowed tightly. His face became even more gloomy and unpleasant. Abigail, finding Nicholas too heavy, was eager to leave and directly ignored the suggestive looks from the others, supporting Nicholas into the house. Abigail's home is a two-bedroom apartment. Last month, when Nicholas came over for dinner, it started pouring rain after the meal. Concerned about his safety, Abigail let him stay overnight and arranged a bed in the adjacent room for him. After the first time, it became a regular occurrence. Nicholas often came over in the evenings, had dinner, played games with her, watched TV, chatted, and stayed until very late, using the excuse of it being too late to leave. Abigail shared this with her best friend, who remarked, "A man's intentions are often 90% about wanting to be with you." Reflecting on all the details since they got together, Abigail asked Nicholas one evening after dinner, half a month holding hands, a month kissing on the face, 3 months kissing. "So, when do you plan to go further?" Nicholas's response was vivid in Abigail's memory. he said, holding hands and kissing require the initiative of the guy, but going further requires the girl's consent. So, if you don't give me any hints, I won't touch you. Of course, if we get married, I'll definitely touch you on our wedding night. Her best friend said, Abigail, don't believe his sweet talk. You have to test him. For this reason, occasionally during dinner, they would have some drinks. Nicholas had never let himself get drunk, but Abigail was often 7 parts drunk out of 10. The first 3 times, she pretended to be drunk because she wanted to see if Nicholas was truly a gentleman. On those occasions, after requesting a long kiss, Nicholas would sit quietly by her bedside, guarding her through the night. So, Abigail didn't see any problem with letting Nicholas stay overnight. This time, Nicholas was genuinely drunk, holding Abigail's hand and talking nonsense. Abigail, Hudson is single now. If he tells you he likes you, will you break up with me? Will you go back to him? Abigail felt that the question was meaningless because Hudson couldn't possibly like her. I'll go get a towel to wipe your face. Lie down for a while. She broke free from Nicholas's grip, turned and went to the living room. The man sitting on the sofa startled her. She recognized him as Hudson but was still taken aback. When Nicholas first came here, he noticed that her room password was Hudson's birthday. He suggested changing it to his birthday, and Abigail didn't object. She wanted to change it anyway but forgot later due to being busy. She hadn't told Hudson about changing the password. Walking over, she sat on the single sofa farthest from him and asked curiously, "How did you know the password?" Hudson's face was grim. He squeezed out a few words through his teeth, guessed it. "Why change the password?" Abigail lifted the cup and took a sip of water. "I have a boyfriend now, using your birthday is not appropriate. Nicholas might get jealous." Hudson took a sharp drag of his cigarette, turned to look at Abigail, his expression unreadable. "Have you really fallen in love with him?" Abigail noticed that since she started dating Nicholas, Hudson's tone when talking to her became consistently ambiguous, despite the fact that he was the one who initially brought them together. Thinking of Nicholas, Abigail propped herself up on her knees. "If you're okay, you can go back." As she took a step, Hudson suddenly stubbed out his cigarette and strode over, grabbing her wrist and forcefully pulling her into his arms. When Hudson leaned in for a kiss, Abigail instinctively turned her face away and struggled. Her resistance angered Hudson, and he pressed her onto the sofa, gripping her chin tightly with red eyes. "Abigail, don't you like me? How could you fall for someone else so quickly? Does Nicholas know you've liked me since high school? You don't love him, do you? Being with him is just revenge against me, right?" His voice was loud, and the door to the guest room seemed to rattle. Suddenly, Abigail felt that the Hudson in front of her was a stranger. For the first time, a wave of repulsion surged from the depths of her heart toward Hudson. See? He knew she liked him. He had always known, so he was just pretending not to know. Endless anger and humiliation fueled Abigail with unexpected strength. She forcefully pushed Hudson away and dragged him out of the room by the arm. As she closed the door, Abigail said, "Hudson, I suddenly don't want to be friends with you anymore. Let's not contact each other in the future. I wish you happiness." Back in the guest room, Nicholas was already asleep. Abigail sat by the bed for a while. When she stood up to go back to her room, a hand grabbed her arm. Nicholas didn't open his eyes, just tugged her arm and pulled her onto the bed. Similar to the time he had a fever, he held her tightly in his arms, his voice hoarse. "Abigail, let me hold you." Abigail stayed still, slowly returning the embrace. She nestled quietly in his arms, contemplating whether to ask him if he heard what happened in the living room. Before she could ask, the sound of Nicholas's steady breathing reached her ears, and he fell asleep again. Abigail closed her eyes, finding a comfortable position in his embrace. She thought, it can wait until tomorrow to ask. Nicholas left. He left without saying goodbye, not even bidding Abigail farewell in person. That morning, when Abigail woke up, she found 4 messages on her phone from him. "Abigail, I'm sorry. I didn't sleep all night, hesitated a lot, and decided to bid you farewell in this way because I was afraid of hearing your answer face to face. Sorry, I wasn't actually drunk last night. I just wanted to ask you that question under the pretext of being intoxicated. I wanted to know if, in case Hudson comes back for you, would you leave me? You didn't answer me. I heard your conversation in the living room last night. Hudson asked you a similar question, and you didn't answer him either. So, I know your answer. Abigail, you're conflicted right now, aren't you? If you still like him, go find him. You don't need to feel guilty towards me. I hope when we meet again, you can be happy." After reading the messages, Abigail was in tears. She didn't know why she was crying, but she didn't want Nicholas to leave. She wanted to explain, but when she called Nicholas, his phone was turned off. Without time to put on shoes, Abigail ran outside barefoot, only to be stopped by Hudson. Hudson seemed to have waited for a long time. With a cigarette between his fingertips and cigarette butts at his feet, he furrowed his brow upon seeing Abigail barefoot. Ignoring her resistance, he carried her into the house. "Abigail, I regret it." Hudson had always known that Abigail liked him, but he couldn't respond to her at that time because his thoughts were all on Kinsley. He thought Kinsley was his love until she fell in love with a senior at the same school and they broke up. After the breakup, he went through a 2-year slump. During those 2 years, he actually considered being with Abigail. That night, he also knew it was Abigail lying beneath him, and he couldn't help himself. But in the end, looking at Abigail's nervousness and fear, he suddenly felt like a jerk. Because he felt he didn't love her, he just considered her as a comfort to fill the emotional void. That's why he deliberately called Kinsley's name. The next day, he didn't know how to face Abigail. When Kinsley returned, he thought he still loved her, so he accepted her back. When Nicholas confessed his feelings for Abigail, Hudson felt uncomfortable for the first time. But at that time, he genuinely thought Nicholas was a good guy, so he went along with it. However, as Abigail and Nicholas grew closer, he regretted it. When Abigail's devotion to Nicholas surpassed her feelings for him, he felt even more uneasy. "Abigail, I actually stopped loving Kinsley a long time ago. It was just my unwillingness to accept it. I love you, Abigail. Give me another chance, please. I promise I won't lose you again." That day, Hudson spoke from the heart. Abigail listened attentively, and after he finished, she remained silent for a long time, uttering only one sentence. "Hudson, I can now be sure that I can let you go. Although I haven't fallen in love with Nicholas yet, I am also certain that I want the person by my side in the future to be Nicholas." After that day, Abigail never saw Hudson again because she sold the house that had nearly exhausted her youth and moved back to her parents' home. Nicholas's phone remained off, and all messages couldn't get through. Abigail knew he had blocked her. Later, Abigail found a friend of Nicholas and asked her to deliver a message to him. "Nicholas, I'll give you only 1 year. If you don't come to find me within that year, I won't wait for you." Days passed, and Abigail's expectations gradually diminished in the daily wait. To ignore the panic and restlessness within her, she threw herself into work. In that year, she got promoted and received a raise, but Nicholas didn't show up. On the agreed-upon last day, she was invited to Nicholas's friend's wedding. Holding on to a last glimmer of hope that she might see him at the wedding, he didn't appear. After the wedding, Abigail walked aimlessly through the streets, feeling incredibly desolate. Indeed, Nicholas had given up on her. She didn't blame him because she could understand. Due to her understanding, she didn't seek him out, nor did she inquire about him from his friends. She wanted to leave the final choice to him. Tired from walking, Abigail found a bench and sat down. When she looked up, snowflakes were falling from the sky. She didn't know when it had started snowing, only that it was bitterly cold. She felt like crying, not knowing why, just feeling the urge. In the icy world, Abigail knelt on her knees and wept heartily. After crying, she stood up to leave, only to realize that the snow was getting heavier, but her clothes were still clean. Abigail was stunned, and suddenly she raised her head. Above her, someone had opened a coat to shield her from the snow, just like that snowy night years ago. Their eyes met, and Abigail cried and smiled simultaneously. Nicholas pulled her up, and Abigail's legs went weak, falling into his embrace. Nicholas naturally held her, wrapped his coat around her, and nuzzled her head with his chin, his voice hoarse. "Abigail, have you made up your mind? If you're with me, you can't still like Hudson." Abigail directly hugged his neck, tiptoed, and gave him a sweet kiss, her answer. Nicholas took off his coat and draped it over her, then carried her step by step forward. Abigail lay on his back, her face against his, asking him why he came now. Nicholas said that when a friend conveyed her message to him, he knew she had chosen him in the end. Although he was eager to come find her, he was afraid she acted on impulse and would regret it later. After all, she had liked Hudson for so many years, it wasn't possible to forget him so quickly. Thus, he deliberately had the wedding set on the last day of the deadline and sent her an invitation. His friend asked him how he was so sure she would come. Actually, he wasn't sure, he just knew that if she still chose him, she would definitely come. Fortunately, he waited for her. As the snow fell harder, and they hadn't walked far, Abigail whispered to Nicholas's ear, "Nicholas, if you keep going like this, you'll catch a cold again at night. Turn left ahead, there's a hotel. We'll be there in 2 minutes." Nicholas's eyes deepened, and his Adam's apple rolled. He turned to her, his voice husky, "How many rooms should I book?" Meeting his gaze, Abigail smiled shyly, "If you agree to marry me and, to help you save for a wife, I think 1 room is enough." When Hudson saw Abigail again, it was 5 years later. She and Nicholas had already been married, and they had a 4-year-old son, an adorable little bun, who was practically a miniature version of Nicholas. They met at a friend's wedding. Upon seeing her, Abigail's face carried a sense of resolution as she gracefully greeted him. "Hudson, long time no see." Hudson knew Abigail no longer loved him. When she looked at him, her gaze was calm, devoid of the once fiery passion. Nicholas walked over, took the sleeping son from Abigail's arms, and naturally held her hand. A harmonious and warm picture of a family of 3 contrasted with Hudson's forlorn solitude. Abigail's gaze had been fixed on him since Nicholas appeared. "Husband, when can we leave? I want to go home." Nicholas greeted Hudson and then led Abigail forward. In the air, you could vaguely hear snippets of their conversation. "I know you're tired. That's why I just went in to say hello. Let's go home now. What do you want for dinner tonight?" "I want ice cream." "Oh, wait, it's not me who wants it, it's your little son." "That's our daughter. She's only 3 months old." "How do you know it's a daughter?" "I insist on having a son." "Wait, why do you like having a daughter?" "Because our daughter looks like you." "I like you." Hudson stood in place, took a deep drag of his cigarette, a trace of self-mockery appearing at the corner of his lips. A sudden wave of endless regret engulfed him. If only he had discovered his feelings earlier. If he had, he should be the one standing by Abigail's side now. Unfortunately, there were no ifs. Abigail no longer belonged to him.